Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Workers' Reading Room. Today I'm continuing with American Trade Unionism by William Z. Foster. This is Chapter 3, The Great Steel Strike. The AFL leaders, with their social peace wartime policy, made no effort to organize the more than ripe basic industries. Indeed, they actually hampered such work. Sufficient proofs of this were the fact that I, a rank-and-file worker in industry, had to initiate the National Packing House campaign, and that we faced AFL opposition from start to finish. The AFL leaders were even less interested in organizing steel. Again, the vitally important work had to be started by myself, who was by this time a lesser official, and again, breaking through AFL sabotage constituted the major problem in organizing the workers. The AFL's reactionary attitude towards organizing meatpacking and steel was characteristic of its policy in all the industries. What growth the unions made during the wartime was mostly spontaneous, the work of rank-and-file militants. AFL sabotage of the steel campaign began immediately after the Chicago Resolution was adopted. Our resolution asked the AFL to lead the work, but Gompers thought to liquidate the matter offhand by referring the CFL resolution to the approaching convention of the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers, AA. He might as well have sent it to the United States Steel Corporation, as the officials of this company-controlled union. Naturally, the AA convention evaded the whole business. But I was not to be sidetracked so easily, and I reintroduced the resolution into the CFL. Here it was once more adopted, and I was sent to the AFL convention in St. Paul, June 1918, as CFL delegate to get action upon it. What happened at the convention was a classic of AFL organization methods. Gompers let the resolution be adopted without change or opposition, for such resolutions make good reading matter for the rank and file. Besides, there are better ways to get rid of unpleasant resolutions than by directly rejecting them. My resolution called for a meeting of steel industry delegates during the convention to start the campaign. So, after waiting a few days and no meeting being called, I became alarmed and, inquiring from Secretary Morrison, was informed that it would be held in about 6 weeks. Time was the very essence of my organizing plan, and delay would be fatal. We simply had to utilize the war situation if it was to succeed, and the war might end very shortly. I therefore protested to Morrison that this postponement was disastrous and in violation of the resolution, which very specifically provided for holding the meeting during the convention. A day or two later, suddenly and without notifying me, an announcement was mumbled just before the convention's noon adjournment that the steel meeting would be held during the lunch recess. Think of it, a conference to organize the nationwide steel industry of 500,000 workers squeezed into the lunch period, with the delegates hurrying out to eat before the afternoon session. Very clearly it was a deliberate attempt to kill the campaign. Despite my experience with AFL bureaucrats, I was shocked and astounded. I could see the steel campaign going to smash at its very start. At the designated corner of the convention hall, a number of delegates, on their way out to eat, stopped off, in curiosity mostly, to see what was going to take place. No Gompers or Morrison was there, and no one was in charge. I hastily called the meeting to order, and organizer Tom Flynn got on a table and began a speech about the need of organization. I could see that lack of time made such a course fatal, so I interrupted Flynn and proposed that we only take the names of all present and call a meeting for the next night, over which we should invite Gompers to preside. Then we adjourned our lunch recess steel organizing conference. Now came the problem of getting Gompers to come to our meeting. That afternoon I informed him of what had taken place. The arch-bureaucrat listened in a bored manner, but he became furious when I invited him to the proposed meeting and refused point blank. Evidently, he had already had enough of this bothersome steel campaign, which refused to be killed. Then I pulled the ace out of my sleeve. I showed him the list of officials, our knot of curiosity seekers, who had attended this steel meeting, and I told him it was they who were inviting him. Then his tone changed, and he grumbled out that maybe he would attend. So Gompers was roped in for the meeting. Now it remained to lasso the other necessary union leaders. To accomplish this, I asked Gompers if he would make the announcement to the convention of the proposed steel meeting. "No, you do it," he fairly yelled at me. So, that afternoon, I ventured to state to the convention that upon the request of Mr. Gompers, I was authorized to invite all concerned to the steel conference, at which Gompers would be present. I could see Gompers getting purple as I said this. We had a good crowd, Gomper's name attracting them. Thus had succeeded my little strategy of netting Gompers by using the names of my curiosity seekers and, on the other hand, of drawing in many other officials by utilizing Gomper's name. By such a device did I literally have to trick the AFL leaders into this vital organization campaign. After this maneuver, I felt as though I had been swimming in a sewer and future prospects for the work seemed most unpromising. The principal thing our steel meeting did was to call a formal conference to take place 6 weeks later. This was a deadly loss of time. The best organizing period American labor had ever known was fast slipping away as the war neared its end. 4 months were criminally wasted from the time I originally introduced my resolution on April 7th until the first real conference was to be held in August. Such delay can only be termed deliberate sabotage. At the St. Paul meeting, however, after much struggle, I managed to have the proposed conference scheduled for Chicago. I did this in the hope that thereby John Fitzpatrick, who was not at St. Paul, could be drawn into the work as AFL organizer in Chicago and thus help protect the sprouting campaign from the hostile reactionary bureaucrats. The Chicago Conference. The Chicago Steel Conference was held in the New Morrison Hotel, August 1st to 2nd, 1918. Representatives of 15 international unions were present. When the meeting got down to business, the chairman, Gompers, turned to me and said, "Well, Brother Foster, you have called us together. Now what do you propose?" That was the great Gompers' approach to organizing the steel industry. He had brought no proposals whatever. So I proceeded to outline my plan, which can be summarized as follows. There should be a whirlwind campaign of organization initiated at once and simultaneously in all important steel centers. This to be carried on jointly by all unions claiming jurisdiction in the steel industry. There should be used such methods as huge mass meetings, noted speakers, brass bands, parades, full-page newspaper advertisements, etc., to set the masses in motion. As financial means, I propose that each union should assess itself 25 cents per member, and to begin building an organizing crew, that each union should delegate 3 or more organizers. To carry on the work, all the unions should be closely federated, with a national committee headed by an AFL representative. The union should establish a uniform small initiation fee. I calculated that this was such a great drive, we could get the bulk of the steel workers under our leadership in about 6 weeks. That is, 3 weeks' time to assemble our money and organizers, and 3 weeks to carry through a great series of 3 mass meetings in each town. These meetings, I figured, would give us such a grip on the masses of workers that we could at once send our committee to the Steel Trust, with an implied threat of a national steel strike if the committee were not received, a threat that we could enforce. This plan for a great, swift, simultaneous organizing drive in all steel centers was realistic and practical. It conformed to the actual situation and to the potentialities of the unions. It offered the best possible way to arouse the steel workers' enthusiasm and to outwit the inevitable counter-strategy of the employers. The workers were in a militant mood and would have surely responded in decisive masses. My time schedule of 6 weeks was also strictly feasible. It had only taken us about 9 weeks to get the great masses under our leadership in the packing industry and successfully to threaten a strike, and in view of our riper experience, added prestige, and greater resources, we could have done the job much quicker in the steel industry. This would have brought our movement to a head while the war was still on, and the government and the Steel Trust could not possibly have faced a wartime strike in this great munitions industry. Had my proposals been adopted, we would have won through easily and definitely established the unions in the steel industry. The plan of federating the unions was likewise practical. It was at that time the logical next step towards industrial unionism and the building of a single steel workers' organization. This was so because at that period there was little positive sentiment for industrial unionism in the AFL, and it would have been utterly impossible to get the many craft unions to surrender their jurisdiction claims to the little, half-dead, corruptly led amalgamated association. The system of industrial federation was succeeding on the railroads, and we had just won a great victory with it in the packing industry. It was a case of either a joint movement by the crafts or no campaign at all. I of course intended to try to push the crafts into an eventual General Steel amalgamation if our campaign succeeded. My financial plan was similarly feasible. All the larger unions were rich with the wartime flood of initiation fees and dues. My own union, the Railway Carmen, for example, had some $3 million in its treasury. Each of them could have paid the 25-cent assessment from its funds without the slightest difficulty. Inasmuch as there were some 2 million members in the 24 unions eventually affiliated to our steel campaign, this would have given us several $100,000. I estimated that $50,000 would have sufficed to put on our great planned drive for 6 weeks. The Chicago Conference, however, made ducks and drakes of this whole realistic plan. All that remained when the unenthusiastic bureaucrats got done with it was the principle of a federated campaign. The conference set up the National Committee for Organizing Iron and Steel Workers, which eventually included the 24 unions of iron miners, coal miners, steam shovelmen, clay workers, quarry workers, seamen, steel workers, stationary engineers, firemen, laborers, machinists, railway carmen, blacksmiths, coopers, electricians, boilermakers, pattern makers, bricklayers, structural iron workers, foundry workers, molders, sheet metal workers, steam fitters, and switchmen. The movement thus covered the whole industry, from the workers who produced the raw materials to those who delivered the finished products to the railroads. But none of the unions had more than a handful of members in the great unorganized steel industry. Gompers assumed the chairmanship of the National Committee, and I was elected secretary. This was, like the secretaryship of the Stockyard Labor Council, for me an unpaid job, as I drew my wages from the BRC of A as a regular organizer. My proposal for an immediate, huge national drive in all steel towns simultaneously was killed. The top AFL bureaucrats present listened fishy-eyed and with ill-restrained disdain as I outlined the sure victory that must come from such a national drive. Several of them took to the floor and, treating my plans as purely visionary, absurdly proposed instead concentrating the work in one locality, even in one steel mill, to show the workers what we can do and thereby win their confidence. Gompers listened impatiently when I proposed the 25-cent assessment. He did not even discuss it, nor did any of the others. It was simply ignored. Thus, the vital assessment proposal went by the boards, and instead of the at least $50,000 indispensable, the 15 unions present voted the National Committee the ridiculous sum of $100 each, and in place of the crew of 100 or more organizers that I held to be immediately necessary, a mere half dozen were delegated to the work. As for the AFL itself, it neither gave nor pledged a dollar. On the second day of the conference, after my proposals had been well knocked on the head, Gompers withdrew from the meeting to join his convivial building trade cronies in the nearby hotel. To preside in his absence, he named John Fitzpatrick as the ranking Chicago AFL organizer. This, at least, was good. My strategy of getting Fitzpatrick into the campaign was succeeding. I was deeply dismayed by the results of the Chicago Conference, its defeat of my practical plan to organize the steel industry. It was pretty clear that the AFL leaders were not interested in organizing the steel workers. One would think, from the resources given our national committee, that we were setting out to organize a bunch of peanut stands, instead of the 500,000 almost totally unorganized workers in the steel industry, American finance capital's chief open shop stronghold. It was such reactionary policies as these that cost the AFL the loss of 5 million to 10 million possible members during the wartime. The final defeat of the steelworkers 16 months later was directly traceable to the rejection of my plan by the Gompers leadership at the Chicago Conference. The organizing campaign. I dare say that when the Chicago Conference adjourned, few of the labor bureaucrats attending it thought that much more would be heard from the annoying steel campaign. But we went ahead anyhow. However, instead of a great sweeping campaign opened by a National Steelworkers Week, with huge meetings, parades, etc. in 50 to 75 steel towns simultaneously all over the country, we had to confine our activities to the Chicago Calumet district. We at once began work in Gary, South Chicago, Joliet, and Indiana Harbor. As far as we could, we applied the methods that we had intended using nationally. But of course, these local activities were only a pale imitation of what our planned great national drive would have been. Nevertheless, we scored an immediate and tremendous success. In Gary, at our first meeting, 15,000 steelworkers attended, and similar mass turnouts were had in the other 3 steel towns the same week. Steelworkers poured into our unions by the thousands. At the end of the month's time, we could, if necessary, easily have struck all these great Chicago district steel trust mills. This was a brilliant demonstration of the correctness of my original plan. Without the least difficulty, had the trade union leaders so willed it, we could have accomplished simultaneously in every important steel town throughout the United States what we had done in the Chicago district, and the experience showed that we could have got the masses behind us in even less time than I had figured on. Had the Gompers leadership backed my plan with the necessary men and money, and they had plenty of both, our success in the Chicago district showed that well within the 6 weeks' time I had set, we could have been knocking at Judge Gary's door and threatening him with a national strike. With the war still on, such a strike movement could only have resulted in a victory for the steelworkers. Rejection of my original plan was tantamount to a refusal to organize the steel industry. But what a different prospect faced us now as we began to get underway. Our big successes in Chicago, although they failed utterly to arouse the enthusiasm of the AFL leadership, greatly alarmed the Steel Trust heads, who previously had not taken us any more seriously than had Gompers, so they set out to fight us relentlessly. In the next months, lacking men and organizers, we laboriously spread our movement to other districts. We met the most skilled and ferocious resistance of the steel employers. To head us off, they gave 4 successive national wage increases and finally the basic 8-hour day. A month after our Chicago success, the war came to an end and an industrial slump set in. The whole situation weakened our offensive, robbed us of the advantage of surprise, and the employers' counteroffensive against us correspondingly was greatly intensified. As we now slowly battered our way into one steel fortress after another, we faced wholesale suppression of the right of assembly in the steel towns. Our organizers were slugged and arrested, and one, Fanny Sellens, was murdered. Many company unions were organized to block us. 30,000 workers were discharged for union membership, Ku Klux Klan movements were fostered, elaborate spy systems were used against us, etc. In short, we faced the whole battery of weapons of the Great Steel Trust. All these overwhelming difficulties would have been avoided, of course, by carrying through my original plan. Our work was now many times more difficult, but of our multiplying difficulties, the most serious was the steady sabotage we suffered from within our own ranks, from the affiliated union leaders. They systematically and shamelessly betrayed the steel workers into the hands of the Steel Trust. The tremendous importance to the working class of organizing the steel industry, though it stirred the violent resistance of the capitalists, left the AFL leadership quite cold. One of the gravest forms of this official AFL sabotage was the practice of the top leaders, with few exceptions, to stay away from the meetings of our national committee and to delegate in their stead powerless local business agents. Thus, they escaped giving support to the campaign, while at the same time making an appearance of going along with it. The consequence was that we were constantly strangled for want of resources and unity of action. Gompers himself was the worst offender in this respect. He was actually chairman of our national committee, but he never spoke at a meeting of steelworkers in the whole campaign, nor helped us raise $1 in money or build a crew of organizers. And about the only way I could get him to come to our meetings was to call an occasional meeting under his very nose, in the room of the AFL Executive Council in Washington, and sometimes even then he evaded it. Gompers always pleaded lack of time. He found plenty of time, however, to spend several months in Europe helping rig up the infamous Versailles Treaty. He also found time to junket down to Mexico City to set up that tool of American imperialism, the Pan American Federation of Labor, but he had no time for the steelworkers struggling so desperately to establish trade unions. I remember that once, during a special crisis, for want of funds, organizers, and more concerted action by the unions, I was drafted a very strong letter urging all the affiliated union heads to attend our next national committee meeting. Then J.G. Brown, our general organizer, went to Washington to get Gompers to sign it jointly with me. Very reluctantly he did so. Upon receipt of the letter signed by Gompers and myself, various steel union leaders called up Sam and inquired how about this letter, was it really so urgent, etc. Whereupon Gompers told them that it was all right, only a routine meeting. Result, the same old kind of meeting with nearly all the decisive leaders absent. Even Gompers himself did not come. With such a lead from Gompers, the various union heads felt quite safe in the neglect and betrayal that they perpetrated constantly against the steel campaign. Gompers hung on to the chairmanship of our national committee, usually commissioning John Fitzpatrick to serve in his place. Finally, on the eve of our big strike, he quit in order to free himself of responsibility and definitely appointed Fitzpatrick as chairman. The sabotage of the steel campaign by the top officials of the 24 affiliated unions is clearly revealed, beyond possibility of contradiction, by the financial figures of the movement in my final report. The total funds eventually contributed to our national committee by its 24 unions were only $101,047. This starvation amount, which we painfully extracted from them over a period of many months, was supposed to finance a great nationwide organization campaign of 14 months' duration and to feed and otherwise finance a 3.5-month strike of 365,000 steelworkers. Actually, all things considered, as I showed in my book, The Great Steel Strike and Its Lessons, the steelworkers financed their own movement with the funds they paid in as initiation fees and dues. And even this sum of $101,047, together with what the 24 unions themselves spent for their average of 3 organizers apiece, was more than offset by the huge sums, not less than $500,000, that we turned over to them and that was collected by themselves in initiations and dues from the steelworkers. The unions were flush with money at the time, and had they been sufficiently interested, almost any one of them could, alone, have given more to our strike movement than all of them did together. The fact is that 3 needle trade unions, the amalgamated clothing workers, the ladies' garment workers, and the furriers, outside the steel industry altogether, donated a total of $180,000 to our strike relief fund, or almost double what the whole 24 affiliated steel industry unions gave during the entire 16-month struggle. The financial sabotage scandal reached its peak in the case of the ultra-reactionary AA of iron, steel, and tin workers. This, the basic union in the industry, actually made a large surplus out of the campaign. From this union, our national committee, for all purposes, including strike relief, received only $11,811.81, although we had turned over to them more than $150,000 in initiation fees, and they had collected probably twice as much more directly from the steelworkers in initiation fees and dues. This union treasury showed a profit of $206,000. With this huge surplus, the reactionary Teague leaders bought, after the strike, a national union headquarters building in Pittsburgh. As for the AFL itself, it raised no money whatever for the organizing campaign. When the strike came, we practically forced it to issue a general call for funds. This raised $418,141.14, but it was collected mostly by our steel organizers, the AFL officers making no effort. These were the only monies we received from the AFL, and they came 14 months after the campaign had begun and 6 weeks after we had 365,000 strikers on the streets. However, despite all obstacles, the SPY system, wholesale discharges of workers, wage concessions, company unionism, terrorism, suppression of civil rights, etc., of the Steel Trust and the deadly sabotage of the top union leaders, we finally managed, in the course of 14 months of bitter struggle, firmly to establish the unions in the many key plants of the Steel Trust in the main steel districts. My final financial report showed a minimum of 250,000 workers organized. There were probably many more than that. Our local staff of organizers could with justice make the proud boast that we had done the impossible, organized the great mass of the workers in the steel industry. Where the AFL had failed utterly for 25 years, we had succeeded. Labor had scaled the ramparts of the greatest of all open shop fortresses. The 1919 Steel Strike. Then came the Great Steel Strike, beginning September 22, 1919. Our committee had approached Judge Gary with our demands, but he refused to meet with us. Meanwhile, all through the industry, a big offensive was on to smash our unions. Over 30,000 of our members were already on the streets, discharged because of union activity. It was a case of either fight or die. We chose to fight. In response to our strike call, 365,000 steelworkers struck in 50 cities of 10 states. Almost every key plant of the U.S. steel and big independents was paralyzed. The steelworkers dealt a smashing blow at their giant enemy. The steel industry had never seen, before or since, a strike remotely approaching such magnitude and powerful effect. The steelworkers fought for the following demands: 1. Right of collective bargaining. 2. Reinstatement of all men discharged for union activities with pay for time lost. 3. 8-hour day. 4. 1 day's rest in 7. 5. Abolition of 24-hour shift. 6. Increase in wages sufficient to guarantee an American standard of living. 7. Standard scales of wages in all trades and classifications of workers. 8. Double rates of pay for all overtime after 8 hours, holiday and Sunday work. 9. Checkoff system of collecting union dues and assessments. 10. Principles of seniority to apply to the maintenance, reduction, and increase of working forces. 11. Abolition of company unions. 12. Abolition of physical examination of applicants for employment. Needless for me to recapitulate, The strike was fought desperately by the steel corporations. The brave strikers had to face a reign of terror set up by armies of scabs, private gunmen, deputy sheriffs, police, and soldiers. Civil rights were completely suppressed in many of the key steel districts. A ferocious campaign of publicity was carried on against the strike all over the country. But worst of all was the sabotage within our own ranks. The persistent treachery of the top leadership now often reached the stage of strike breaking, exemplified by the attempts of the AA to betray the whole movement for a separate agreement, the attempt of the stationary engineers to keep their craft at work, and most disastrous of all, the refusal of the railroad brotherhoods to call out their men, who were organized but without union agreements, working on the highly strategic short roads connecting the steel mills with the mainline railroads. The failure of the AFL national office to rally the labor movement behind the steel strikers, etc. Could defeat have been avoided? The heroism of the steel workers could not avail against all this hostile force. 22 were killed, hundreds were slugged and shot, several thousands were arrested, and over 1.5 million men, women, and children struggled and starved. But the Great Strike, although it eventually abolished the 12-hour day and caused many other improvements, did not win its major objective of unionization. On January 8, 1920, we called it off unconditionally. About 100,000 men were still out, but the strike had lost its effectiveness. The bitter 3.5-month strike was defeated, and the steelworkers' new unions, built with such infinite difficulty, were smashed. In the New York World of April 4, 1922, Gompers charged me with responsibility for the loss of the 1919 steel strike, as follows. This is the same Foster who, in the face of definite information that the U.S. Steel Corporation was prepared for and wished to strike in 1919, and in the face of a request of the President of the United States that the strike be at least postponed, insisted on that disastrous struggle. It took a lot of crust for one who sabotaged the steel campaign like Gompers did to accuse me of wrecking the movement. But aside from that, at the outset, let me say that I am proud to accept my full share of responsibility for the steel strike, even though it was lost. Never was a strike more necessary, more justified historically. To have accepted the proposed strike postponement that Gompers speaks of would have amounted to the rankest betrayal of the steelworkers. His postponement was of a piece with his sabotage policy from the beginning of our campaign. The situation was as follows. On September 11th, just 11 days before our scheduled strike date, President Wilson gave a story to the press demanding a postponement of the strike until after the holding of his National Industrial Conference, which was to begin on October 6th, and which was supposed to establish industrial peace between capital and labor in the United States. Gompers, without consulting us, at once issued a public statement endorsing Wilson's demand to postpone the strike. Then, proving that there was a concerted movement among the top AFL leaders, there poured into our office a stream of wires supporting Wilson's and Gompers' stand from a majority of the union presidents who made up our national committee. A few will suffice to show their trend. I wish to be recorded as in favor of complying with the President's request. W. H. Johnson, President, International Association of Machinists. Engineers will abide by suggestions of President Wilson that we delay action until after Labor Conference at Washington. M. Snellings, President, Steam and Operating Engineers. The Executive Board of the Bricklayers, Masons, and Plasters International Union desires action and steel strike postponed till after Industrial Conference in Washington. William Bowen, President. It is our opinion that there should be no strike called until after the October Conference. J.R. Alpine, President, Plumbers and Steamfitters. A strike at this time would be very inopportune. M.F. Ryan, President, Brotherhood of Railway Carmen. It will be better to postpone the calling of the strike until after President Wilson's conference on October 6th. William Atkinson, Acting President, Boilermakers. We oppose a strike in the steel industry until after the adjournment of the industrial meeting called by President Wilson. J. Wilson, President, Patternmakers. Various other union presidents wired similarly, while the ultra-reactionary officials of the AA dodged about on the question, fearing openly to advocate postponement. The only presidents who definitely opposed halting the strike were those of the blacksmiths and mine, mill, and smeltermen. All this created a real crisis for us. The Steel Trust was violently attacking our unions, and here we were confronted with a demand from the heads of the government and of the AFL, backed by the majority of our committee, that our strike be called off. And worse yet, this demand was framed in such an insidious way as to make it appear that there was requested only a short postponement until Labor's friend, President Wilson, could satisfactorily adjust the whole matter. As for myself, I was entirely convinced that any postponement of the strike would be fatal. I had not the slightest confidence in President Wilson or his three-cornered conference of capital, labor, and the public doing anything for the steel workers. A postponement of the strike would inevitably destroy the workers' confidence in our movement, throw the unions at the mercy of the vicious steel trust, and smash the whole organization in a welter of confusion and wildcat strikes. Far better to take a fighting chance with our 250,000 and more organized steel workers. In any event, the best way to get consideration from the industrial conference was to confront it with a great strike. But what could I do to hold fast to our strike date? To simply call together our national committee would have been suicidal, as the majority were against the strike. Shortness of time also forbade any kind of formal rank-and-file vote or national conference. So upon my own responsibility, I wired and telephoned our field organizers, at least 95% of whom were honest and wanted earnestly to have the steel workers organized, to express the opinions of their local steel councils. Immediately, I received a flood of telegrams showing an overwhelming mass demand to go on with the strike. Thus, a few of them. Unless you call the strike before Friday morning, we will be forced to take matters into our own hands. Gary and South Chicago Steel Councils in joint session. General Committee of all unions at Bethlehem unanimously voted to demand strike action by your committee. Dave Williams, organizer. We cannot be expected to meet the enraged workers who will consider us traitors if the strike is postponed. Organizers of Youngstown District. It is imperative that the strike be not postponed, as the result will be a demoralization of our forces and the creating of a situation that will be positively dangerous. District Organizing Secretaries of Youngstown, Rankin, Braddock, Homestead, Butler, Pittsburgh, Johnstown, Wheeling, Steubenville, Buffalo. Fitzpatrick, although he had little faith generally in strikes, agreed with the field organizers and my opinion that to postpone the strike would be fatal. So we drafted a telegram to Gompers, which the third member of our committee, the AA reactionary Teague, was afraid not to sign, that postponement would mean absolute demoralization and utter ruin for our movement, and demanded that the strike go on as scheduled. Thus, we confronted a head-on collision between the militant masses of steelworkers and the reactionary top union leadership, backed by the President of the United States. It all ended by Gompers and company backing up. They simply did not dare to assume the responsibility of openly destroying our movement and denying the steelworkers their only chance to win. So the Great Strike went into effect as scheduled on September 22nd. But needless to say, its chance for success had been gravely injured by the Wilson-Gompers postponement maneuver, which alienated public sympathy. The outcome of Wilson's National Industrial Conference showed that we were quite right in not surrendering the steelworkers' fate into its hands. At this time, the large employers were just launching the biggest open shop drive in American labor history, the ferocious post-war offensive against the workers to strip them of the better wages, shorter hours, and union organizations they had built up during the war. Wilson's conference, dominated by the greatest capitalist interests, reflected this developing offensive, and it was so reactionary that it immediately split over labor's proposal to grant the workers the elementary right of organization. Even the reactionary Gompers leaders had to walk out of the conference. In going ahead with our strike, we protected the workers' fighting chance, and we would have won the strike had it not been for the strike-breaking tactics of the AFL leaders. To have adopted the Wilson-Gompers postponement would have meant certain disaster, and the greatest strike-breaking shame the American labor movement had ever known. If AFL leaders seek responsibility for the loss of the steel strike, they need look no further than their own general offices. The true cause of the defeat was to be found in their reactionary attitude of indifference, sabotage, and strike-breaking toward the steel campaign from the beginning to the end. Had they adopted my original plan at the Chicago conference, we could have won hands down, at most with a short wartime strike. But their policies of denying the movement the necessary organizers and money crippled the whole campaign and forced it into a period when the war was over, the acute demand for munitions had ended, an industrial slump was at hand, the government had abandoned its conciliatory attitude, and a great employers' offensive was underway. Nor could all the militancy and sacrifices of the steelworkers in their bitterly fought organization drive and heroic strike overcome these obstacles, raised primarily through the sabotaging policy of the reactionary AFL leaders. The strategy behind the steel strike. Naturally, victory in the steel campaign would have given a tremendous impetus to the organization of the workers in all industries. With my appreciation of the importance of trade unionism, I was quite aware of the possibilities such a victory would open up, and I based my general strategy upon them. When we went through in the packing industry, I had been quick to take advantage of the stimulus it gave to the steel campaign, and if the steel campaign had been successful, I was prepared to repeat this procedure and to branch out into a still more ambitious program. The capture of the main open shop fortress, steel, by the trade unions would have made easy the organization of many other industries, and my aim was to take advantage of such situations by having the AFL launch a gigantic campaign of unionization simultaneously in all major unorganized industries. Concretely, I plan to propose that there be set up a big national committee, patterned after our steel committee, which could supervise the work of organization through subcommittees in each and every industry. I calculated that if we managed to defeat the Steel Trust, we consequently would be able to line up the AFL for such a great organizing campaign and carry it through successfully in spite of all official sabotage. We would then be able to organize literally millions of workers and make real progress towards actually unionizing the working class as a whole. It was a bold plan, but a feasible one, had the AFL leaders permitted the steel campaign to be won. Such a great influx of members would, as I was quite consciously aware, profoundly change the character of the trade unions. Among the certain basic changes would be A. To shift the center of gravity from the skilled workers to the less skilled, B. To break down the old system of craft unionism and lay the basis of industrial organization, C. To give the unions more of a class struggle policy and to broaden their social outlook, D. To develop a more honest and progressive leadership. In short, I figured that such a great movement would go far towards realizing the plan which we had nourished for years, the transformation of the AFL into a progressive organization. These tendencies were already clearly in evidence in the packing and steel campaigns. Both movements were based primarily upon the unskilled masses, both were distinctly industrial unionist, both had a fighting policy, and both had developed a new anti-Gompers leadership. It did not require any great brilliance to figure out the above major results of a victory in steel, that is, the organization of millions of other workers and the transformation of the AFL, and it is certain that the shrewd advisors of Gary and his powerful banker associates had more than an inkling of them. They doubtless realized that if we won the steel strike, they would confront a rejuvenated and far more powerful labor movement, for which industry could resist unionization if steel were vanquished. That is why they fought the strike with such a relentless fury. Gompers, a keen old fox, also knew what the unfavorable implications to him of a victory in steel would be, and that is why he, too, sabotaged our struggle. He could plainly see all the industrial union tendencies developing in the packing and steel campaigns, and he could not help but feel them as a growing menace to his whole regime. As for the question of a new anti-Gompers leadership, that matter actually broke out into the open and became a living issue. One day, George P. West, a well-known newspaperman, was in our Pittsburgh office. We had been quite friendly, and inadvertently, I hinted at the broader meaning of the steel campaign to the AFL. West, giving me no inkling of his plan, sprang a scoop in The Nation of April 9, 1919. Dramatically, he pictured the menace the rising Fitzpatrick-Foster combination held for the declining Gompers-Morrison crowd and the transformation of the AFL. Gompers was furious and demanded an explanation from Fitzpatrick. The latter called me up from Chicago. We were in the midst of an organization campaign, and an open fight would surely destroy it. So Fitzpatrick and I agreed to pooh-pooh West's story and let it go at that. But I was astonished and dismayed a few days later when I received a letter from Fitzpatrick containing a copy of his reply to Gompers, fantastically giving the latter vast praise for his work in both the packing and steel campaigns. Both Gompers and other AFL leaders were not reassured by the apologetic letter of John Fitzpatrick. They only felt safe when the strike, with its radical leadership and to them threatening possibilities, was beaten. If these leaders, with few exceptions, sabotaged the campaign from start to finish, it was because they, like Gary, had a vested interest that was in danger. All of which goes to show that the organization of steel and other basic industries is the task of the progressive wing of the labor movement and must be done in the face of reactionary labor leader opposition. This is as true in the 1936 steel drive of the progressive CIO unions as it was of the 1919 steel campaign. The organization of the steel industry was the most advanced point ever reached up to that time by the American Trade Union movement. The unions had deeply penetrated the greatest open shop industry. More was at stake in the 1919 steel strike than in any other in American history. The victory of this struggle, which the union leadership could have brought about, would have raised the whole trade union movement to a much higher level of strength and development. Its defeat, by the same token, was a big factor in intensifying the oncoming heavy employers' offensive and in deepening the reactionary trend in the unions during the following several years. 1936. That is the end of Chapter 3. Hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you for listening to the Workers' Reading Room. Have a good one, folks.
Come you ranks of labor, come union corps, and see if you remember the struggles of before, when you were standing helpless on the outside of the door, and you started building lanes on the chain, and you started building lanes on the chain. When the police on the horses were waiting on demand, riding through the strike with a pistol in their hand, swinging at the skulls of many a union man, as you build one more lane on the chain, as you build one more lane on the chain. Then the army of the fascists tried to put you on the run, but the army of the union, they did what could be done. Oh, the power of the factory was greater than the gun, as you built one more lane on the chain, as you built one more lane on the chain. And then in 1954, decisions finally made. Oh, the black man was rising fast, racing from the shade. And your union took no stand, and your union was betrayed, as you lost yourself a lane on the chain, as you lost yourself a lane on the chain. And then there came the boycotts, and then the freedom rides, and forgetting what you stood for, you tried to block the tide. Oh, the automation bosses were laughing on the side, as they watched you lose your lane on the chain, as they watched you lose your lane on the chain. You know, when they block your trucks, boys, by laying on the road, all that they are doing is all that you have shown, that you gotta strike, you gotta fight to get what you are owed. When you're building all your lanes on the chain, when you're building all your lanes on the chain. And the man who tries to tell you that they'll take your job away, he's the same man who was scabbing hard just the other day. And your union's not a union till he's thrown out of the way, and he's choking on your lane of the chain, and he's choking on your lane of the chain. For now the times are telling you the times are rolling on, and you're fighting for the same thing, the jobs that will be gone. Now it's only fair to ask you, boys, which side are you on, as you're building all your lanes on the chain, as you're building